Good morning, everyone. Good evening.
Morning.
Yeah. So we are very happy to have Ajahn Punnadhammo, the abbot of Arrow River Hermitage, on the Clear Mountain podcast conversation. And I'll just start by reading a short biography of Tanajan. So Ajahn Punnadhammo is the abbot of Arrow River Forest Hermitage in Northern Ontario, Canada. Born in Toronto in 1955, at the age of 23, he began studying Buddhism under Khema Ananda, the founder and first teacher of the Arrow River Center. In 1990, at the age of 35, Ajahn Punnadhammo ordained into the Ajahn Chah forest tradition in Thailand and stayed there for the next 5 years, largely based at Wat Ba Nanachat, the International Forest Monastery. After his 5th year in robes, his teacher Khema Ananda contracted lung cancer, and with death imminent, he asked Ajahn Punnadhammo to return to Canada to assume management of the Arrow River Center. Ajahn Punnadhammo returned with the blessing of his seniors in the order in November of 1995 and was able to spend time with his beloved teacher before his death. Since its founder's passing, Arrow River Forest Hermitage has continued as a place of practice and refuge for both monastics and lay visitors, with Ajahn Punnadhammo as its abbot. Ajahn Punnadhammo is the author of the extensively researched The Buddhist Cosmos, a comprehensive survey of the early Buddhist worldview according to Theravada and Sarvastivada sources. Letters to Mara, which is an insightful and creative allegory in the spirit of C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters, and many other writings which can be found at www.arrowriver.ca. So thank you so much, Ajahn, for agreeing to have this conversation with us. So one thing which I'm curious to ask about is actually your Pali learning. It's abundantly clear reading the Buddhist Cosmos and in your talks that you've spent a lot of time studying Pali, reading Pali texts, and I'm curious how that process went for you. Had you done any study before ordaining, or is all of your study?
It was, well, I don't like to over exaggerate my Pali knowledge. I can work my way through a Pali text laboriously. I'm not real fluent, but I do basically understand the grammar, and I have a decent vocabulary. I never really had formal training in it. I started studying Pali in my early years as a monk with A.K. Warder's Introduction to Pali. I worked my way through that, and I've gone from there. One thing that helped me was that when I was in high school, I studied Latin for 2 years. And that has basically the same grammatical structure. So that was like a big hurdle. Many people studying Pali, the first big hurdle is getting used to the declensions, where I already had that knowledge buried somewhere in the back of my mind from studying Latin for 2 years.
And have you found that, in what way has your Pali study supported your actual practice of meditation or your living of the holy life, practicing the teachings?
I think quite a bit, in that having some knowledge of Pali helps to clarify the teachings. And one thing that I often bring up in my Dhamma talks is the misleading translations in English. That a lot of the common terms in Pali have standard English translations that are not quite right, and they bring in all kinds of false ideas and confuse the actual meaning. And it's not that the translation is wrong as such, it's just there is no English word exactly right. So the translators do the best they can. But some of these words have gotten to be standardized, and people relying solely on the English word often have a misinterpretation of the teaching.
What's a particular problematic term you found, Longfor, with the ones where you feel are the most,
Yeah,
have been the most difficult?
a very, very good example is some of the terms around samatha meditation and jhana, particularly samadhi, which is commonly translated as concentration. And I think that's very wrong. And I think that's actually was a wrong choice to become standardized. Because what I find with people that I'm teaching meditation, a common mistake people make is to force the mind too hard. And the part of this comes from the use of language and talking about concentrating the mind. It's like you're putting an effort and you're narrowing the mind down. You know? Whereas the mind in jhana is actually vast and expansive. It's the equivalent of a Brahma deity's mind, which can contemplate thousands of world systems. So it's not a narrow little point, right? So samadhi should be translated really as stability or stillness. And that's actually how it's in texts like the Visuddhimagga and in the Abhidhamma, where they expand on the term. Those are the words they use: non-wavering, stillness, stability. You know? A similar one is related is ekagata for one of the jhana factors, which is translated one-pointedness, whereas I prefer to say gone to unity or unified mind.
Yeah, those are great examples. As you refer to Buddhaghosa or the Abhidhamma, that's something which is also apparent in reading your Buddhist Cosmos, is that you've read a lot of the commentaries, and these are things which a lot of people don't know about, and are even though they don't know about them, people who are somewhat interested in Buddhism, they've got somewhat of a Protestant bias against
Yes,
paracanonical literature, of
yes.
which they include the Abhidhamma. And you've obviously read a lot of commentaries, and I'm curious if you, which either haven't been translated into English or if they have, aren't widely read. And I'm curious about your own, how you found that the commentaries, Buddhaghosa's or Abhidhamma commentaries, have
Yeah.
supported your own practice.
Well, the main support is a clarification of the teachings. Like if a lot of the if you are, as I did several passages in Buddhist Cosmos, if you're trying to translate from the suttas, very often it's difficult to determine the actual intent or meaning of a phrase without referring to the commentaries. The commentaries will provide clarification of many obscure points. And I think you can see that in if you using Bhikkhu Bodhi's translations. He's very well studied in the commentaries and things, and if you look at his footnotes, he'll often refer to the commentaries to clarify a ambiguous phrase.
Yeah, he does recommend that. Have you, how have you read the commentaries? Have you just like dipped in, here and there as you're interested, or have you actually picked up or looked at digital Pali reader and read commentaries from beginning to end just out of curiosity?
I would say more like the former. It's like when I'm researching something, often I'll go to the commentaries to for that passage to clarify it, which the nowadays with the resources we have available in terms of software, like the digital Pali reader, it makes it so much easier to dip into and cross-reference the commentaries and sub-commentaries.
Yeah, in the Buddhist Cosmos, you kind of, you reference or refer to often these commentaries, and I think you've done some translation. Have you ever translated full commentarial excerpts or?
Well, yeah, there's several of them in Buddhist Cosmos. Um, I translated, for example, a long passage about the wheel-turning monarch that I believe has never been translated or published translation before. I'm not aware of one. There's a few like that. That was probably the longest one I did. And also another one dealing with Uttarakuru, the northern continent. That was another lengthy translation.
Yeah, I find there are a lot of gems, hidden in the commentaries, gems in for us, in that
Yeah,
hidden for us, and that they haven't really been translated into English yet. So
yeah.
yeah, another thing is just you have on your YouTube channel a whole series of lectures on Abhidhamma, which is
Mhm.
another area of the Dhamma, which there are certain groups in the West which have kind of take Abhidhamma as some of their focus, but I find your talks very approachable, and I'm curious if you find the way that you hold Abhidhamma supportive for your practice, or did you study it mostly to get an intellectual understanding because it's one of the three Pitakas, or what's your relationship to
Well,
Abhidhamma?
it's very much supportive of practice, because it clarifies what's going on in the mind. Now, you notice that in Myanmar, it's the heartland of Vipassana meditation and also of Abhidhamma studies, because the two go hand in hand. One is the practice and the other is the theory. And it gives you if you have some knowledge of Abhidhamma, it gives you a better clarity and precision in understanding the processes of the mind that you can observe directly through Vipassana.
Could you maybe say more about that? How they go hand in hand? Because it's not so apparent to me. I know other teachers, maybe even in the Ajahn Chah tradition, who are skeptical of Abhidhamma, or practitioners like Ajahn Buddhaghosa. Sometimes people will quote him, and I haven't seen the original Thai, but they say that Buddhaghosa would discourage study of the Abhidhamma, saying, what is the translation of Abhidhamma? You have Dhamma, and Abhi means too much. So Abhidhamma is just too much Dhamma.
As that I think it Thais generally like to play with these kind of creative translations. Yeah, I think there is a caution to be had about relying solely on intellectual definitions, and that can become a trap. If you like the Zen people talk about mistaking the finger for the moon, right? Another analogy I've heard is you can read a cookbook all day long, it won't satisfy your hunger. Okay? But there is, I think, a practical benefit in knowing Abhidhamma if it's taken hand in hand with direct meditative experience. That becomes one of the things I think that's missing from many people's Vipassana practice is precision. So people sometimes talk about developing open awareness or general awareness, and what that often means in practice is the mind is very fuzzy and unfocused, and it can feel good, but you're not really examining the mind. And the proper Vipassana is being aware of dhammas as they arise. And if you've got an intellectual framework to be able to know and understand what those dhammas are, it can help the process along.
Can you think of any specific examples? I know I heard recently that apparently, according to Abhidhamma, at least one of the four Brahma Viharas, so loving kindness, compassion, altruistic joy, or equanimity, is present in every kusala mind state.
Mm.
That seems like a practical insight or
Yeah, yeah,
practical perspective. Do you have
yeah.
any other instances which you could bring
Well,
up?
one I can, yeah, one that comes to mind is something that struck me uh, early on when I first started studying Abhidhamma, and it's that if the feeling tone, the Vedana of unhappiness, domanassa or dukkha arise in the mind, it's always associated with an unskillful mind state. And that was early on. I that's one of the things that is sort of, at first it doesn't seem, my first reaction to it was, no, that can't be right. You know, you gotta, sometimes you gotta feel bad about something, but you know, then the more I contemplate on it, the more sense it made that there's an unskillful mind state associated with every moment of unhappiness. So that's actually a very powerful insight.
Yeah, that's quite powerful. Yeah, on a daily level, in meditation or not.
Yeah.
There's so many things to ask about, and our time is somewhat limited. One other thing I did want to ask about before passing it over to Tanisabo is actually on the topic of creative writing. I mean, your letters to Mara are just a joy to read,
Mm.
and I'm curious what your process is when you decide to write some kind of Dhamma fiction or Dhamma narrative, and how that supports your own practice, and if you feel that it can do so for other people, and if so, how might one go about that writing process?
Um, well, I don't think I've got any magic formula for writing. Um, I I generally start with a kind of outline, but it may not even be written down, but it's clear in my mind, a kind of broad structure. And then the first pass of writing, I do it pretty much, you know, stream of consciousness, just go and just write something, and then go back to it a day later and edit it and revise it and make it polished. And that's basically how I do any kind of my writing.
And do you find that the process of writing actually helps your thinking process and or your
Well,
meditation process?
yeah, well, I find this with not just with writing, but even with verbal teaching, that it really clarifies my own thinking. If I'm trying to explain something, then I have to clarify it in my own mind and be clear about it. Yeah.
Thank you for those answers and quite practical advice as well. I'm curious, the first thing I ever encountered from you was your Buddhist cosmology book, and just not something you see spoken a lot in spirit rock circles and elsewhere.
Yeah.
I'm very curious about, looking, when you read about the sort of variegated, world which Buddhist cosmology really depicts, it's interesting to find that a lot of the figures are echoed across cultures.
Right. Yeah.
What come to mind are like the Titans and the Greek gods and the Asuras and the Tavatimsa the Thunderbirds of Native American literature and the
Yes.
Garudas.
Yes.
What other resonances have you sort of seen across cultures and mythologies that have interested you?
Well, you mentioned some of the main ones, but the Bhuma Devas, the little dewas of the forests and trees and so on. There's some variation of that in many cultures. They have the Sith in Celtic culture, the fairy people, and in Native America they have the little folk in the forest. That's quite a common theme. The Nagas, giant serpent beings, dragons of some kind or another, are pretty universal. You have European dragons and Indian Nagas and Chinese dragons. There's several things like that we can find. I think as far as that, the battle between the Dewas and the Asuras, you referenced the Greek gods and the Titans. There's the Norse gods and the storm giants. But I've got a theory or an idea that the Tawatingsa level of the cosmology is a common inheritance of all the Aryans. So India, Greece, Norse, because the similarities are so strong. I think that particular pantheon is the Roman, Greek, and Norse pantheon.
So, Lumpur, how do you, I imagine many people listening or watching may not know how to either share the explicit belief in these things, or even if they do, or even if they don't, know how they would use this to any real effect in their practice or lives. What would you say to, the skeptics, and how would one, how do you find this informs your practice as well in terms of that vision?
Well, a couple of things I can say about that. One is to ask the question, are these beings in these realms real, is actually a kind of a naive question, because first you need to clarify exactly how real is this human realm and in what sense. So, it depends what you mean by real. In terms of practice, it is in the Visuddhimagga, one of the 40 meditations is contemplation of Dewas. And the last few years I've been experimenting with that myself, meditating on the different Dewa realms. And I find that it raises the level of consciousness. Like, you imagine it, if you put yourself into higher planes of consciousness, and it lifts the consciousness above the human plane.
Ajahn, could you say more about that? I know in the textual description of what Devanusati, or recollection of the Devas, is, it's quite formulaic, just thinking, oh, they had morality, I have morality too. But how have you been practically applying that?
Well, I start with imagining. It's like a meditative imagination, a meditation of the imagination. I start by imagining the earth plane Dewas and the Nagas and so on, and bring it up through the different heaven realms, then the Chatu Maharajaka, the four great kings, and Tawatingsa, and just kind of visualize being there in the different realms. And I'll take it up to first Brahma level. And sometimes I'll go beyond that and go into the higher Brahma realms.
Do you have images associated with those, Lumpur, or is it sort of just what comes to mind?
Well, it's visualization.
Mm-hmm.
So I have you might say stock images that I have for the different realms that I bring up.
Lumpur, another question we had was, we had a great discussion with Ajahn Sona around sort of Buddhist resonance and influence in history,
Mhm.
where we spoke about, the possible fact, Socrates having jhana perhaps. And I believe I'd recommended The Shape of Ancient Thought to him, and I think he sent it to you. Is the
No, I'm not familiar with that.
Okay, never mind. But regardless, I'm curious if you had any, places where you see, apart from just the mythology, uh,
Mhm.
Buddhist resonance or influence in European or Greek or Mediterranean
Yeah,
circles.
yeah. I think in Greek philosophy, there's some in the Neoplatonists. Uh, there's some definitely some Indian, probably Buddhist influence in their thinking, and some of that got into Christianity through the Gospel of John. Has a kind of a that opening passage about in the beginning was God, and um, the word was God, and the word was with God. And the word in Greek for word is logos, which could also mean mind. Right? So it's that has been interpreted by some people as having Buddhist influence. It's possible.